I walked into the extravagant dining room of my parents' house, the air thick with the scent of pine, expensive wine, and a forced holiday cheer that felt brittle enough to shatter. This was always the worst night of the year. A performance of perfection I could never quite master. I was Sofia Carter, 26 years old, and tonight, I was just trying to survive dinner. We were halfway through the prime rib, a feast that could have fed my entire apartment complex for a month, when Grandma Eloise Vance set down her sterling silver fork. She was seated at the head of the immense mahogany table, a regal figure in deep emerald silk, someone who commanded silence just by breathing. She looked straight at me, her eyes the same sharp, observant gray as the winter sky outside. Her voice, which was rarely raised, cut through the room's chatter like a razor. "Still living in the house I bought you, Sofia?" I froze. The question was so unexpected, so direct, that my breath hitched and stalled in my throat. My hands, which I had been carefully resting on my silk napkin, began to shake. I could feel the blood draining from my face. My parents, Daniel and Elaine, sat perfectly still beside me, their practiced smiles collapsing into pale, stark fear. I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the clink of crystal. I don't live in any house, Grandma." The room plunged into an immediate, profound silence. Guests who had been exchanging pleasantries suddenly focused on their plates, choosing absolute quiet over acknowledging the bomb that had just detonated. Grandma Eloise didn't move. She simply turned her head, slowly, elegantly, to look at my parents. Daniel's jaw locked tight, and Elaine, my mother, pressed a hand to her chest as if she couldn't get enough air. Their faces had turned a terrifying, sickly pale. I knew something was terribly wrong. I didn't have a house. I lived in a fourth-floor walk-up apartment building with cracked brick, rusted railings, and a heater that rattled like an empty soda can. I had two part-time jobs, one at the museum, one catering, just to keep up with the rent for that one miserable room. I had been told, for years, that I wasn't responsible enough for real property, that I lacked discipline and financial maturity. My current existence was a desperate, exhausting struggle, a sharp contrast to the effortless luxury surrounding us now. Just this morning, I had been catching water from my leaky ceiling in a chipped plastic bucket, the mold creeping further down the window frame. Yet, here I was, pretending to belong in a house where everything shone. My internal conflict flared instantly, the familiar wave of shame washing over me. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I had misunderstood Grandma years ago. Maybe my parents had done something responsible with the money because I was simply too weak or too much of a failure to handle it myself. That was the story I had lived with for years. I was unworthy. Daniel finally cleared his throat. Too loud and too aggressive. "Mother, she just misunderstood you," he said, forcing a thin, cheap laugh that bounced off the high ceilings. "Sofia struggles, as we've told you. She just isn't ready for property. We were protecting your investment." His words, "Sofia struggles, protecting your investment," were a knife twisting the shame deeper. They were delivered with a paternalistic contempt that was utterly convincing, designed to make Grandma think I was an irresponsible child. But beneath the sharp words, I saw the panic in his eyes, the terror of a truth too large to bury. I thought of the empty refrigerator in my apartment, the nights I layered 3 sweaters just to sleep, and the fear that kept me from asking for help. I was 26, and my entire life was built on a series of quiet humiliations. And now, Grandma Eloise was staring at Daniel, not with confusion, but with the cold, precise look of a woman who had just realized she'd been lied to, extensively and cruelly. "Where did the money go, Daniel?" she asked softly. Her voice didn't crack with age. It cracked with betrayal beginning to surface, an elegant, controlled storm gathering in the silence of the room. "The money," I realized with a sickening lurch. The $400,000 she had set aside for my future wasn't gone because I was irresponsible. It was gone because they had taken it. The 799 words. The horrifying silence in the dining room stretched for what felt like 10 minutes. Though it was probably only 10 seconds. My parents' sudden pallor and Daniel's desperate attempt at it told me everything I needed to know. The secret of the stolen $400,000, the money that was meant to buy me a simple, safe future, was now exposed, hanging in the air like the heavy scent of betrayal. Grandma Eloise did not press the point immediately. Instead, she leaned back, studying my parents with an expression of cold pity that was far worse than anger. My mother, Elaine, reached for her wine glass, her fingers trembling so badly that the crystal chimed softly against the marble tabletop. Daniel ran a hand over his perfectly sculpted hair, his gaze refusing to meet his mother's. He was a man trying to bury a truth that was already fully exposed and breathing. She misunderstood you, Daniel repeated, the lie sounding weaker this time, thinner and more cheap. Sofia struggles because she overspends. She's not ready for property. We were protecting the investment. My internal conflict flared again, a painful mix of self-blame and dawning rage. Overspends, I thought. I hadn't bought new clothes in 6 months. My meals were carefully rationed leftovers. I thought of the damp, wheezing breath of my dying heater and the exhaustion of working 2 jobs while they sipped vintage Merlot. Richard and Elaine, Grandma Eloise said, a sign that she was done with the pleasantries. You told me she had moved in. You sent photographs of her smiling by a lake. Daniel stared intently at the expensive oak floor. My mother covered her mouth with her napkin, a silent gesture that spoke volumes. They had manufactured a fantasy, a cruel, detailed lie, about a life I was supposedly living, all while I was barely scraping by in a mildewed box of an apartment. My breath came back in sharp, shallow pulls. For years, I had believed their narrative that I was flighty, that I was undisciplined, that my poverty was simply a consequence of my own weak character. Now, faced with Grandma Eloise's unwavering, knowing gaze, I realized the full extent of their cruelty. They had not just spent the money. They had actively worked to keep me small, silent, and ashamed so their own comfort could thrive. Grandma Eloise turned back to me. The silence returned. Yet this time it didn't feel threatening, it felt protective. Sofia? She said quietly, her voice only slightly above a whisper. Tell me where you live. Tonight. Daniel shot up from his seat, the sound of his chair scraping the hardwood floor painfully loud. That is completely unnecessary, Mother. Her place is perfectly fine. We already told you? Perfectly fine. Grandma Eloise echoed, her voice gaining steel. If her place were perfectly fine, you would not have needed to send me fraudulent photos of a lakeside property. You would not have needed to lie to me for years. She pushed her chair back slowly and stood up. The small movement was devastating. She picked up her cane, a polished dark wood, and tapped it once against the floor. A sharp, clear sound that sliced through the last of Daniel's excuses. We go now, she stated, looking Daniel and Elaine directly in their panicked eyes. And no one stops me. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear of my parents, but from the terrifying realization that this was it. The irreversible break. I felt an odd mix of dread and dizzying freedom. I stood up and without looking back at the shocked faces of the dinner guests, or the pleading desperation in my mother's eyes, I followed my grandmother out of the house. We were halfway through the conflict, and the scene was shifting from the golden cage of their deceit to the harsh reality of my survival. 698 words. We drove through the city in silence, the air in the back of Grandma Eloise's town car, feeling heavier than the years of secrets I had carried. The transition from the blinding gold light of my parents' dining room to the dark, quiet sanctuary of the car was jarring. Grandma Eloise didn't speak. She didn't lecture or ask loaded questions. She simply sat beside me, a soft, unwavering presence, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the flashing streetlights. Her silence was the most profound kindness I had received in years. It told me I didn't have to defend myself or explain my poverty. She was just there with me, something my parents had never truly been. When the car finally slowed and stopped in front of my dilapidated apartment building, I braced myself for her judgment. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew exactly how it looked: the cracked brick facade, the exposed utility lines, the single flickering bulb above the entrance that always seemed to be dying. The rusted railing of the front steps shook visibly if you touched it wrong. This was the raw, humiliating evidence of my failure, or so I had been told. Grandma Eloise stepped out first. She paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the peeling paint and the dirty windows of the four-story structure. She didn't recoil. She didn't show disgust. But when she finally spoke, her voice was a thin, shaky whisper that broke something fragile inside me. "They let you live here." Sofia? That sentence? The sheer weight of it was the first time I realized my struggle wasn't just mine. My parents hadn't just neglected me. They had allowed this. They had witnessed my diminishing life and chosen to finance their own comfort instead. The deep-seated shame I carried, the feeling that I deserved this hardship, began to crack. We climbed the narrow, worn stairs. Inside my tiny apartment, I felt a desperate urge to hide the stain on the carpet, the hole in the plaster, the permanent chill in the air. But Grandma Eloise saw everything. She moved slowly through the single main room, her cashmere coat brushing the peeling paint of the walls. Her fingertips lightly skimmed the threadbare edge of the sofa where I slept. She walked into the kitchenette, paused at the empty shelves, and then stood beneath the patched-up ceiling. I watched her eyes land on the plastic bucket I kept permanently positioned near the window frame. It was catching the slow, rhythmic sound of dripping water from the leak that I couldn't afford to fix. When she turned to face me, her eyes were filled with unshed tears, but her gaze was resolute. "Sofia," she whispered, and the sudden use of my first name felt intensely personal. "You survived more than they ever admitted." Her words were the key that unlocked years of pain. All the loneliness, the forced gratitude, the quiet comparisons that diminished me. It all came flooding out. I told her about the missed meals, the second job I took just for heating oil, and the constant, gnawing fear of being late on the rent. I told her about the shame, the belief that maybe I truly wasn't worth the cost of a decent life. She walked toward me, her step unwavering, and took my cold hands gently in her warm, soft ones. "My dear girl," she said, her voice now steady with conviction. "They didn't just fail you. They built their comfortable, false lives on your silence and your hardship." For the first time, I saw the truth not as a deep, festering wound that proved my inadequacy, but as evidence, something I could hold, something real that proved their crime. The feeling was frightening, but it was also empowering. The sheer weight of self-blame lifted, replaced by a cold, righteous anger. Grandma Eloise squeezed my hands firmly. "Tomorrow," she stated, "we stop letting them rewrite your life, effective immediately." The time for passive observation was over. The time for the reckoning had arrived. I knew then that my period of quiet struggle had ended the moment someone finally listened and validated my reality. 998 words, I barely slept. The exhaustion of the confrontation clashing with a tense, unfamiliar energy. I could hear Grandma Eloise moving softly in the guest room. The sound of her pen scratching on paper, feeling like the quiet sharpening of a long, overdue sword. She was preparing for the inevitable, organizing the facts that would dismantle my parents' careful lies. I spent the early hours staring at the ceiling, no longer viewing the water stain as a mark of my failure, but as a silent witness to my parents' crime. The cold, righteous anger that had begun to bloom when Grandma Eloise validated my survival was now channeling itself into controlled determination. I stopped seeing myself as the shrunken, inadequate victim. I started preparing to be the survivor who fought back. By 9 o'clock that morning, we were both dressed. Grandma Eloise was impeccable, her coat buttoned, her cane polished, her expression carved from quiet, formidable steel. Together, we walked into the sleek, modern office of Jonathan Albright, the family attorney. Jonathan Albright, a man who looked permanently stressed, nodded curtly to Grandma Eloise. He slid a stack of files across the immense conference table. We bypassed the usual pleasantries. The time for niceties was over. Mrs. Vance has given me a complete history of the funds in question. Jonathan began, his voice dry and professional. We are addressing the $400,000 transfer made 6 years ago, intended for men's Sofia Carter's housing trust. He then pulled out copies of the original transfer document, clearly showing Grandma Eloise's signature and the explicit purpose of the gift. Looking at that paper, I felt a fresh wave of disbelief. That money had existed, earmarked for me, and I had spent 6 years freezing in a leaking apartment, while my parents used it as their personal slush fund. Jonathan continued, laying out bank statements and property deeds. The funds were immediately diverted and used as the initial down payment on the Lakeview property, which is currently in Daniel and Elaine West's names. This was followed by a series of significant expenditures tied to that same account. He proceeded to list them: renovations, new designer furniture, a boat slip rental, and several large, international vacations. Each line item was a fresh insult, proving they hadn't just used the money, they had flaunted a lifestyle built on my stolen future. Later that afternoon, I met with Sarah Cooper, my best friend, for coffee. Sarah was the only person who knew the truth of my financial desperation, and even she was reeling from the scale of the theft. I always knew your dad was controlling, Sofia, Sarah said gently, stirring her latte. But this is different. You have to stop defending them, even in your head. What they did wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated action. They wanted you dependent and grateful. Her external validation was a crucial piece of the puzzle. I needed to hear it from someone outside the Vance Carter bubble, someone who saw my reality clearly. Sarah reminded me of specific instances where Daniel had undermined my efforts to save money or discouraged me from moving out of the city, always under the guise of good advice. I felt the last vestiges of my self-blame crumble. I started to understand that my inability to get ahead wasn't a character flaw. It was a consequence of a system designed by my parents to keep me beneath them. I channeled the intense shame and hurt into focused energy. I had the truth. I had the evidence, and I had Grandma Eloise and Jonathan Albright ready to act. The preparation was complete. The time for the confrontation was set for the next morning. 997 words. When we walked into the lawyer's office the next morning, Daniel and Elaine were already there, seated across the table. They were perfectly composed, looking less like people caught in a devastating lie, and more like two people prepared to deliver rehearsed excuses. Daniel wore a forced, wary sigh on his face, a practiced look of martyrdom. Elaine's eyes were slightly red, suggesting just enough stress to garner sympathy, but not enough to look genuinely remorseful. Grandma Eloise and I sat down opposite them. I felt a powerful shield of quiet strength emanating from my grandmother. I was terrified, my heart a frantic, trapped bird. But I gripped the edge of my seat, reminding myself that the truth was now my armor. Jonathan Albright began immediately, his tone clipped and professional. Let's address the $400,000 transfer made to the housing trust 6 years ago. That money was explicitly designated for Sofia's first property. Daniel leaned back in his chair, affecting an air of bored patience. We've addressed this. Jonathan, we were overwhelmed by her immaturity. We thought Sofia wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. We used the funds responsibly to stabilize the family during a temporary cash flow crisis. Cash flow crisis. Grandma Eloise repeated softly. She didn't raise her voice. But the two words hung in the air, heavy with skepticism. Jonathan slid a thick binder toward Daniel and Elaine. Then explain these expenditures. He opened the binder, revealing crisp copies of bank statements and invoices. The immediate down payment on the Lakeview property. The subsequent $22,000 in landscaping renovations. The $75,000 custom kitchen installation. And several documented payments for furniture and luxury travel, all tied directly to the diverted trust account. Elaine inhaled sharply, clutching the arm of her chair. Daniel's practiced composure shattered. His face drained of color, leaving a sickly gray cast. He couldn't look at the documents. The sheer volume of evidence, laid out clearly on the mahogany table, was overwhelming. Daniel exploded, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet room. That money saved this family? We did nothing illegal. We simply prioritized the family's stability over Sofia's frivolous wants. We used it responsibly. Just not exactly how Mother intended. He was desperate now, trying to spin the theft as an act of noble self-sacrifice. He looked directly at me, his eyes burning with accusation. We've given Sofia everything she needs. She's manipulating you now, Mother. She's always been weak. She's taking advantage of your failing memory. Enough. Grandma Eloise stood slowly. The room stilled instantly, the air growing thick with her authority. Daniel, she said, her voice low and steady, a devastating instrument of truth. You let my granddaughter struggle for rent and heating, forcing her to work 2 minimum-wage jobs, while you drank wine on a lake deck funded by her future. He opened his mouth to argue, but she raised a single, silencing hand. The words died on his lips. You lied to me, she continued, her voice gaining a crushing weight. You lied for years. You built your comfort on Sofia's hardship, actively diminishing her, so that she would not question your control. You did not save the family. You stole from your own daughter. My parents sat frozen, unable to mount a defense against the clear, unarguable fact of their betrayal, articulated by the one person whose judgment truly mattered to them. The conflict was no longer a secret whisper in my own head. It was a loud, undeniable reality, delivered with devastating finality. I felt my fear receding, replaced by a cold, resolute strength. They had no control over me anymore. The truth had finally given me the power to remain silent and simply witness their collapse. 1199 words. The attorney's office was silent, except for the low whir of the air conditioning and Daniel's ragged breathing. He had ceased his explosive denials, recognizing that his theatrics held no weight against Grandma Eloise's controlled fury, and Jonathan Albright's stacks of documentation. I watched my parents, no longer with fear, but with a horrifying, detached curiosity. They looked small and defeated, stripped of the golden armor of their wealth and status. Jonathan Albright folded his hands over the evidence binder. There is one final matter to address, he announced, his voice regaining its sharp, professional edge. In light of the documented misuse of trust funds and the ethical breach of duty to her granddaughter, Mrs. Vance revised her estate planning. Daniel instantly tensed. Elaine's breath hitched, a small, frightened sound. This was the true threat. Not the repayment of $400,000, but the loss of the entire, vast Vance estate. The source of their generational power. Jonathan reached for a fresh set of documents, sealed with official red tape. Effective immediately, he began, reading aloud. The prior will and trust structure are revoked. The revised documents names Sofia Carter as the primary and sole heir to the Vance family trust and all current holdings. Furthermore, Mrs. Vance has assigned Sofia as the sole executor of the estate. Every word was a slow, controlled explosion. Elaine gasped, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Not of remorse for me, but of sheer, unadulterated loss for herself. Daniel lurched forward in his seat, disbelief cracking his voice like dry wood. "You're giving everything to her," Daniel yelled, the sound raw and desperate. "She didn't earn that? We built this family. We held everything together." Grandma Eloise didn't flinch. Her stare hardened, transforming her eyes into chips of cold stone. "No, Daniel," she corrected him softly. "You didn't hold everything together. You held everything as back. And what you stole from Sofia was far more valuable than the money. You stole her belief in her own worth." The accusation of theft, now coupled with the loss of their inheritance, caused Daniel to completely unravel. He slammed his hand down on the table, making the glasses jump. "This is manipulation! She is weak! She doesn't deserve any of this! She will squander the entire estate in a year." That familiar word, weak, hit me. But this time, it didn't hurt. It just sounded hollow, the final, pathetic attempt of a desperate man to regain control through emotional cruelty. Enough. Grandma Eloise's cane struck the floor with a sharp, echoing crack that stilled the room completely. It was the absolute climax of the confrontation. A sound of definitive, final authority. "She survived what you caused. That is strength." Daniel physically recoiled, as if the truth itself had struck him across the face. Jonathan Albright, sensing the moment of finality, slid one last document across the table. It was a single, clean deed of title. As a demonstration of good faith and immediate restitution, Jonathan stated, looking only at Daniel and Elaine. "The Clearwater Bay property, the lake house, purchased with the diverted funds, will be transferred to Ms. Sofia Carter's name immediately. The signed transfer documents are here. You have 7 days to vacate the premises. There will be no extensions, no negotiation, and no discussion." My mother started to weep uncontrollably, the sound a ragged mess. Daniel stared at the deed, his entire world cracking at the edges. The place they had flaunted, the symbol of their successful lie, was now being taken back. I felt a surge of terrifying, yet exhilarating, validation. This wasn't about revenge, it was about the fundamental rebalancing of justice. Grandma Eloise looked at me, a soft, wary smile touching her lips. "We are almost done, sweetheart." She then faced my parents again, her expression devoid of anger, holding only a heartbreaking resolve. "The lies end today. Because you cannot steal a future without losing your own." The full scale of their loss, both material and moral, settled over the room. My parents' control was gone. I 1297 words. The days following the meeting felt heavy and unreal, the air thick with the waiting game of paperwork and emotional fallout. The confrontation in Jonathan Albright's office had been climactic and definitive, but the silence afterward was a nervous, lingering pressure. Grandma Eloise, however, moved with calm purpose, ensuring every document was signed and every legal requirement met. I stayed close to her, learning more about strength and integrity in 48 hours than I had in 26 years with my parents. On the third morning, Jonathan Albright called my temporary phone. "The transfer is signed, Sofia," he said quietly. "They surrendered the Lakeview property deed. It's officially yours. 7 days to vacate." I felt a sudden lightness, a giddy sense of disbelief. The place they had flaunted for years, the house purchased with my stolen future, was finally, irrevocably, mine. Jonathan hesitated. "There's more. They're filing appeals, of course. Your father, Daniel, is publicly blaming you." My stomach knotted immediately, the familiar sensation of panic rising. "Blaming me for what?" "For manipulating your grandmother," Jonathan relayed professionally. "For coercing her and turning her against them. He's telling anyone who will listen that you are an unstable opportunist who has stolen their legacy. The words hit harder than the threat of a lawsuit. I had spent years carrying their silence, their subtle punishments dressed as advice. Now they were rewriting the story again, casting me as the predatory villain. The betrayal had a new, sharper edge. They intended to ruin my reputation, just as they had ruined my finances. I relayed Jonathan's warning to Grandma Eloise. When I finished, she set her porcelain teacup down slowly. The cup trembled slightly in the saucer, but her hand did not. "Let them talk," she said, her voice steady. "Lies age quickly. The truth, eventually, endures." But the truth was complicated. The public humiliation was painful, and it brought back all the old, destructive self-doubt. Did I deserve this? Was I, in fact, manipulating the one person who finally loved me? That afternoon, the crisis came to my doorstep. Daniel West appeared at my dilapidated apartment building, pounding on the door and shouting my name, his voice thick with raw rage and desperation. I opened the door only because Grandma Eloise was standing right behind me. He tried to push inside, his powerful shoulder hitting the jamb. Grandma Eloise lifted her cane instantly, blocking him with quiet, absolute authority. "You don't dictate this space anymore, Daniel," she stated. Daniel's face twisted with venom. "You poisoned her mind, Mother! You took everything from us!" "We were trying to teach her responsibility." Before Grandma could speak, I took a small step forward, planting my feet firmly. My voice was low, shaking slightly, clear. "No," I said, meeting his eyes. "You took everything from me first." He scoffed, the sound dripping with contempt. "You don't deserve any of this. You couldn't handle a house. You couldn't handle real responsibility." "You're still an irresponsible child." His words should have sent me shrinking back into my old habit of self-blame, but they didn't. Because I wasn't standing alone this time. I was standing with the proof of my survival. Grandma Eloise placed a warm, firm hand on my shoulder. "She handled your neglect, Daniel," she said, her voice growing sharper. "She handled your absence. She handled your silence. What she couldn't handle was believing that her struggles were entirely her own fault." Daniel's mouth opened, but the words were stolen by his own shock. Grandma continued, calm and devastating. "Your inheritance is gone. Your control is gone. And the daughter you deliberately ignored and diminished is no longer yours to manipulate or harm." Suddenly, my mother, Elaine, appeared behind Daniel, her face swollen with tears and panic. "Please, Sofia, we're family. For years, we were family." Those 3 words, "we were family," had been the chains that bound me, the excuse for every cruelty. Tonight, they held no power. "We were family," I said softly, looking past Daniel's rage to her pleading, tear-streaked face. "Until you both chose comfort over me." I closed the door gently. The solid click of the lock, a clear sound of finality. Daniel's muffled shouting continued for a minute before fading away. For the first time, I felt the balance shift entirely. Letting go of their approval wasn't punishment for them. It was survival for me. I had finally used my voice to defend my own truth. 1297 words. The lake house was quiet the first night I slept there. Too quiet, almost unreal. It was a strange echo of the life I should have been living. A life of comfort and space that had been stolen and then abruptly, surgically restored. I moved slowly through the spacious rooms, touching the windows, the smooth kitchen island, the walls that were clean and dry. These were the spaces my parents had occupied, enjoying a luxury funded by my hardship. Yet, as I walked, I felt no anger, only a profound sense of reclaiming something that was always mine. I spent the next few weeks sorting through the strange psychological residue of my past. My parents' appeals faded quickly. Daniel stopped his public tirades, likely realizing that attacking his primary heir was not a wise strategy. Grandma Eloise visited often. She would sit by the vast expanse of the water, I wrapped in her soft gray shawl, her cane resting beside her. Sometimes she told me stories about her own early career struggles, subtly reinforcing the idea that worth was earned through action, not simply inherited. Sometimes she said nothing at all. Her presence, calm and accepting, healed things I didn't even know were broken inside me. My mother, Elaine, sent one letter. It was long, filled with flowery apologies, carefully wrapped around thin, sharp excuses. She wrote about the overwhelming pressure Daniel had been under, and the mistake they had made in judgment. She never quite said, "I stole from you." Grandma Eloise held the letter gently. "Do you want to answer this, Sophia?" she asked, giving me total control over the emotional closure. I shook my head. Some closures don't need words, Grandma. Some truths stand without explanation. I dedicated one of the lake house rooms to my art. I filled it with warm, natural light, canvases, and soft fabrics. It was the quiet, dedicated space I had begged for my entire life. Without the constant, draining pressure of 2 jobs and perpetual fear of eviction, the work came easier. Breathing came easier. Breathing felt new. When the first snow of the season arrived, several weeks after I moved in, I stood on the deck, watching the huge flakes fall softly over the still surface of the lake. I held the soft wool of Grandma Eloise's shawl close to my neck. I whispered into the cold air, "I'm safe now." I was safe, not because of the house or the money, but because I had chosen myself. I had faced the truth of my parents' betrayal, allowed myself to be vulnerable enough to accept help, and then found the strength to use my voice. I had refused to be the victim in their narrative. Grandma Eloise squeezed my hand, that evening as we watched the sunset over the frozen water. "You've built a beautiful life, Sophia," she said. "And you did it with honesty, not just inheritance." Peace didn't roar into my life like the victory I might have imagined. It arrived softly, like the snowfall on the still water. It came the moment I refused to shrink and finally accepted that the life I deserved wasn't something to beg for, but something to claim. I had lost a family, but I had finally found my future. So 797 words.